Take a minute to get started, and I will mute and turn off my camera, and then just tell me when you want me to.
All right.
I'll share the PowerPoint as soon as this finishes. All right.
Okay. Do I just X out of that? All right. Good morning, everyone. We have quite a packed agenda because this training typically is done over an 8-hour period, if not 8.5 hours. So we are going to get in and go. Go ahead and start my PowerPoint. I don't see it yet. Do I have to do something? Just aha, perfect.
Got it. All right.
There we are. Yes. So welcome to the UST owner operator training. Next slide. We're here. This is specifically for compliance assistance to tribally owned and operated gas stations from around the nation. Every gas station in the nation that's on tribal lands follows the same federal rules. We're going to talk about a few things today. Next slide. Release detection and prevention is, of course, a big one. Next slide. Really quickly, we want to say why USTs are dangerous. One, they're active environments, and they have undetectable leaks can happen, and that can result in a large leak, and 1 gallon of gasoline can contaminate 1 million gallons of water. So when we're talking about leak detection, we will talk about gallons per hour, which is GHP, and systems today can detect leaks as small as 0.1 gallon per hour with 95% confidence. Of course, most leaks are much larger than that. Next slide. So what exactly is 0.01 gallons per hour? It's basically a can of Diet Coke. I don't know why I have Diet Coke in there. I'm not a Diet Coke drinker, but it's, you know, quite a bit it's a larger leak than what you might think. Next slide. And why do we do this? Well, historically, you know, the gas stations look something like this. If you are on a tribal lands, you've probably seen some old-fashioned ones. Here's an underground storage tank of the past, which was just, wood. I guess oil, wine, and wine and gas were put in. Well, wine still is, but gas was. Next slide. So we're going to go quickly through some definitions. Next slide. What is an underground storage tank, and why do we regulate them? Well, a UST, a tank, is any underground piping connected to the tank that has at least 10% of its combined volume beneath the surface of the ground. Why regulate them? Leaking USTs have resulted in threats to human health from impacts to soil and groundwater. Next slide. Here is a typical tank situation. So you have the underground storage tank and piping that stores petroleum and meets the combined volume of at least 10% of product. Next slide. An owner is anyone who owns an UST system used for storage, use, or dispensing of regulated substance, i.e. petroleum products. An operator is probably one of you listening to the call today, is any person in control of or having responsibility for the daily operation of an UST system. Next slide. So here's some definitions. Ancillary equipment devices such as piping, fittings, flange, valves, pumps used to distribute, meter, or control the flow of regulated substances from an UST. Cathodic protection is a technique to prevent corrosion of a metal surface by making that surface the cathode of an electrical chemical cell. A tank system can be cathodically protected throughout the application of either galvanic, I can't say the right, anodes or impressed current. Compatible, the ability of two or more substances to maintain their respective physical and chemical properties upon contact with one another? Do they work together? So your tank has to be obviously compatible with what's being stored in it. Next one. Existing tank is any tank that has been installed before December 22 of 1998. Free product refers to a regulated substance that is present as a non-aqueous phase liquid, meaning liquid that's not dissolved in water. Maintenance is operational upkeep to prevent an EST from releasing product, and a release is a spill, leaking, emitting, discharging, escaping, deposing from an underground storage tank into water or leaching. Next slide. Now we get to the nitty-gritty. Next slide. Tank operations. So the goal is that owners and operators are responsible for making sure that their ESTs do not leak. It is your job as an operator and as an owner, and typically tribes are the owner and then the gas station manager is the operator, and your job is to make sure that your tanks do not leak. Proper operation and maintenance of your EST is essential to reducing the risk of a leak. Monitoring, of course, is necessary and is required under federal law. Next thing. Next slide. So, do you know what's down there? Every operator should know what's down there. We should, a typical system consists of tanks, piping, spill prevention, overfill protection, corrosion protection, and a release detection system. Next slide. Here's a, I think you skipped one. No? How weird. I have a slide that disappeared. Anyway, here is a typical EST system, what it would look like underground. So you can see how the tanks lay. Next one. So here are the federal regulations and requirements, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Class A, Class B certification that's required by EPA, and all of what I'm about to share is going to potentially be on the test that you take to achieve your Class A or B certification. Next slide. So here is 40 CFR Part 280. This is where in the Code of Federal Regulations, that's what CFR stands for, here is where you're going to find all of the federal requirements that tribes are expected to comply with. Next slide. So EPA is they're the ones who regulate EST facilities on tribal lands, and then they have EPA inspectors. I am hopeful that I will have a federal credential by next year, so I would be the one who could come and inspect your underground storage tanks on your reservations. I've been out on a few inspections with the EPA inspector already. Some of you may have met me. Next slide. Here's the program scope. So next slide. These ESTs are not regulated, are excluded from the types of inspections that I would be doing. Tanks holding certain hazardous waste, typically above ground, wastewater, certain equipment tanks, tanks that contain 110 gallons or less, as systems with a de minimis concentration of regulated substances, containments for emergency spill or overflow, as systems containing radioactive materials, farm or residential tanks less than 1,100 gallons, tanks removed from the ground before May of 1986, septic tanks, I'm not checking those out, tanks for storing heating oil and used on the premises where they're stored, surface impounds, pits, ponds, lagoons, stormwater, wastewater collection systems, flow-through process tanks, and tanks on or above the floor of underground basements. So these are not regulated. I have, I don't have anything to do with those. Next slide. So here is the design, construction, and installation notice. Regulations for EST system subpart B notification. Everyone who is currently operating a gas station is aware that there is a notification that has to take place. Sometimes contractors may not know, but I can guarantee you if you have currently been inspected, you are already, EPA has already received the notification of your installation within 30 days of coming into service. Additionally, if ownership changes or significant repairs or replacement of equipment is required, notification is required. Next slide. So installation, when a tank is installed, it must be installed properly and according to the manufacturer's specification. This is a question on the Class A certification. So keep in mind, when a tank has been installed, it has to be installed not to EPA's regulations, because EPA has no such regulations, but according to the manufacturer's specifications. The installer must give you a certification of proper installation and should give you a equipment installed site map. So you should have that. Retain your install records for the life of the system. So one good practice is to always have pictures. You should have these records on file. I've heard situations where the tribal government keeps those records, but the gas station should also have those records for just historical purposes and ease of if an inspector comes on and wants to see those things. So sometimes the inspections differ depending on who's the inspector. So one of them might want to see those, but make sure that you keep the install records for the life of the system. So design construction, upgrading existing systems. If you're operating, and I just saw an email today, oh, go back. Or no, oh, you're right. I just saw an email today about insurance. There are concerns, or I guess people are having difficulty in insuring tanks that are in the ground that have been in the ground for longer than 30 years. So upgrading existing systems tanks must be upgraded to meet one of the following: having an interior lining, cathodic protection, or internal lining combined with cathodic protection. So again, this is going to be a question that you're going to see on the Class A, could see on the Class A. And so when you're upgrading the system, they must be upgraded to meet one of the following, not all three. Piping, metal piping must be upgraded with cathodic protection. Tanks and piping installed or replaced after April of 2016 must be secondarily contained and must use interstitial monitoring. So again, these are potential questions that you're going to be asked on the Class A or Class B certification. All existing systems must comply with new UST spill and overfill protection equipment requirements. Next slide. Next slide. So spill prevention, spill bucket installed at the fill port. It must contain the drips and spills from fuel delivery. It must be liquid tight, and then it must be tested by October of 2018 and every 3 years after that. So your spill buckets around the fuel delivery area must be liquid tight, and it has to be tested every 3 years. Oops, somehow we skipped ahead a little bit, but that is going to be a question on the test. So here's your spill bucket area. You can see that it's what it looks like. Typically, the lid up on top is going to be something that I, as an inspector, I'm going to come along and ask for you to open so that I can look in. And I'm going to be looking for how clean it is. Well, not how clean it is, to make sure there's no leak or liquid in there. I have been to some gas stations that are super clean and some that are, well, I don't know. I think they only look at them every 3 years. Next slide. Drain ports. They're primary entry for water into the tank, so make sure you check for dirt during your monthly walkthroughs. Monthly walkthroughs is a requirement of a federal requirement, so your gas station should be keeping monthly walkthrough checklists on hand for us to inspect. We will want to see, if we come in December, we want to see from the previous December a record of those monthly walkthroughs. And that is also on the test. Here is 2 spill buckets. One is double walled, obviously, and the other is not. Next slide. Spill protection is designed to temporarily contain spills. It's not designed to contain fuel for long periods of time. They are usually less than 5 gallons in size, and they keep all spill buckets clean, keep the water and dirt out, and keep the fill caps locked. Is this a tight spill bucket? Next one. Spill buckets that are cracked need to be replaced. So if your spill bucket looks like this, it needs to be replaced. Next slide. You need to make sure that you are, next slide. Oops. Oh, nice. Go back, please. One more. Forward. Go forward. Sorry. One more. What? Oh, okay, that's strange. I'm missing, some of my slides didn't come in, but that's all right. So when you have overfill protection, you want to make sure that when deliveries are happening, that you are monitoring the deliveries, because it is your responsibility as a owner operator to make sure that spills do not happen. So one of the ways you can do this is to make sure that there is enough empty space in the tank. You can either use a stick or a tank gauge and fill the tank to 90%. Always monitor your deliveries to protect your environment and your tribe's investment. So, and typically your delivery person can give you an estimation very quickly of how much fuel they can drop. Next slide. Overfill protection. Equipment is installed on the S that is designed to stop product flow and reduce product flow before the tank becomes full and begins to release petroleum into the environment. There are 3 types of overfill protection. There's the automatic shutoff flapper valve. There's the ball float, which has been eliminated with the new regulations of 2018. Keep that in mind for the Class A, Class B certification, and have an overfill alarm. Next slide. So how do shutoff valves work? The drop in the drop tube. So as the delivery is provided, or drop down into the top of the fuel, there's a float in there that rises, and it automatically cuts off the ability for fuel to be dropped down in. See that little cool action? Perfect. Next slide. So the overfill protection with the ball float was eliminated, and you cannot replace an existing ball float. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. This is the ball float valves. We won't really talk about those. Next slide. So overfill protection and alarms. So if you have a Veeder-Root system or a system, you're going to hear an alarm if your tank distributor attempts to drop more fuel than space is available, and it will activate an audible alarm or a visible warning when the delivering person when the tank is either 90% full or within 1 minute. Make sure that the delivery person can hear the alert. It's okay to go and press the alert to make sure that it's operational, and the alarm must be inspected every 3 years. That will be a question on the test. Next slide. Overfill protection. It is not on your ATG. It's typically outside where you can hear it. Next slide. Must have tight fills with ball foot valves and drop tube devices for overfill prevention to work. This is not a tight fit. See how it's just kind of shoved in the hole there. Next slide. Here's some overfill protection, what it looks like. This is an old ball float valve that's been corroded. Next slide. And why do we worry about that? Because a vehicle can catch on fire. Next slide. We're going to watch this little video. That's what happens when you don't monitor your fill. It can get really messy really fast. Yeah, all right, next slide. So, for as long as the S system is used to store petroleum, owners and operators shall ensure that releases due to spilling or overfilling do not occur. The owner or operator shall ensure that the volume available in the tank is greater than the volume of petroleum to be transferred to the tank before the transfer is made, and that the transfer operation is monitored consistently to prevent overfill. So, what is your facility's protocol? Next slide. Do you stick the tank first, and do you monitor deliveries to prevent overfills and spills? Next slide. You are the boss. Remember, once the delivery is on your property, it is your responsibility. You need to hold the driver responsible. Inform the company of any problems, and always tell them thank you for not spilling. Make sure that you give lots of positive reinforcement. Next slide. Stage 1 vapor. I'm not going to talk about stage 1 vapor recovery, because while it is a regulation, it is not a regulation under the UST, but it is a requirement that you need to think about. Next slide. Next slide. Monitor your deliveries, because you know, in historical cases, it has not been it has happened where the delivery person has stuck something in there so that they stop an alarm from sounding. So again, monitor your deliveries. Next slide. General operating requirements. Next slide. You must report, investigate, and clean up spills, overfills, and suspected releases. A suspected release is the discovery of product on site, a sheen or a soil stain. Usually you can tell that there might be something going on with erratic dispensing. You might have a failed tank and line test alarms, and inventory lost, and unexplained water in the tank. So make sure that you are doing your due diligence in reporting, investigating, and confirming if there's been a spill. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to talk about corrosion and cathodic protection. Cathodic protection systems must be tested within 6 months of install or repair. And again, this is going to be on the test every 3 years after. So your cathodic protection systems must be inspected every 3 years. Impressed current systems must also be inspected every 60 days. Again, questions from that will be on the test. There are some facilities that do have impressed current systems, and an upgrade requirement does exist. Next slide. Spill and overfill control. Compatibilities. Again, this is going to be a question on the test. UST systems made of or lined with materials that is compatible for a substance stored. Repairs must be properly conducted according to a code of practice. Again, that's going to be a question. EPA does not tell you how to repair your systems. It must be done in accordance with the code of practice by a nationally recognized association or independent testing lab. If there are repairs that are made, testing needs to be done to monitor for leaks, and you must maintain a record of each repair for the remaining life of the system. Record reporting and record keeping are essential. Next slide. Repairs must be properly conducted per manufacturer's inspection or industry approved standards. You need to be at the site to observe and watch the repairs. Repaired tanks and lines must be tightness tested within 30 days and undergo approved monthly monitoring, and keep your repairs for the life of the system. Next slide. What goes into your compliance binder? So now every one of your facilities should have a compliance binder. This is the binder that we will ask for when we come on to inspect your facility. We will want to see your records. I don't even want to begin to tell you that some people have a very difficult time finding their records, but those facilities that have a binder with all the information in it is fantastic and makes our inspection go very quickly. Here's the next slide. Here is the information that you should have in your binder. In this in this classroom, I have uploaded a sample binder. I've uploaded several documents that you will find very helpful in achieving a good inspection and being prepared. So you need to have your tank and piping leak test reports, your system repairs, your compliance reports, again, your monthly walkthroughs. We need to see 12 months of those. Insurance and financial responsibility certifications. We need to, it can't be at the tribal office or headquarters. It needs to be at your facility where we see you have insurance, which is the financial responsibility. You need to see your notification forms. You need to see we don't need to see your install records, but it's recommended that you have them in there. We need to see the third-party certification for your ATG. We need to see if there's a permanent closure. We need to see that there was a site investigation at the closure. We need to see incidents, releases, corrective actions. Permanent closure records would be mailed to EPA if it was something that was going to be closed. We also need to see your operator training and certifications for A, B, or C. If you're a manager, you need to have A, and if you are a cashier, you need to have C. And then, of course, we need to see the yearly and 3-year equipment tests that you have. So you need to keep a record of your tests. Next slide. So reporting includes notification forms and certification of installation, reports of releases or suspected releases over 25 gallons. If you see a spill that's over 25 gallons, you need to report that. Any corrective actions also need to be reported, and notification of closure or a change of product. Again, these are things that you're going to find on the Class A or Class B certification. Leak testing and release detection. Next slide. Next slide. US systems must provide a method or combination of methods for release detection that should be able to detect a release from any portion of the tank or piping. Must be installed, calibrated, operated, and maintained in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. Again, EPA doesn't have any instructions for this. Manufacturer or best practices by a nationally recognized organization. It must meet the performance requirements. And again, if a release occurs, again, over 25 gallons, you need to notify the implementing agency. Next slide. So requirements for petroleum systems, passing a per tank test every 30 days using an approved method. Inspect your ATG, ALD probes annually. You must have for pressurized piping, the mechanical leak line detector. You need to have an annual line tightness test from a contractor. And you need to have electronic leak line detector monitoring tests that are from your ATG. Most new ATGs, and I think even the older ones, can be programmed to do this monthly automatically. Typically, you would print these reports off and have them in your binder, but the system can also store these reports. So make sure that your system is set up. Next one. So there are different ways of making sure that you do not have water in your tank. This is just a sample or example of a product that you can use to make sure that there is no water in your tank. Next slide. So your tank tightness test must be capable of detecting a 0.1 gallon per hour leak from any portion of the tank that contains product. New and upgraded tanks may use a combined method of inventory control and tank tightness testing for periods of up to 5 years. Tank tightness testing can be used for monthly requirements if conducted monthly, and you need a copy of your last 2 test results or certification from an outside contractor to be a part of your records. Next slide. Sump Sensors. Your ST sump, your dispenser sumps, your shutoff valves, your alarm, is it connected, properly positioned? So here are some sump sensors, and these will tell us if there is liquid that's leaked out into the containment area. And typically we like to see these sensors to be on in the lowest point of the sump. So you know, it's not a positioning isn't a federal requirement. However, it's just smart practice to have it at the lowest point in the tank, because of course water will go down to the lowest portion of the tank. Next slide. Tanks must be monitored at least every 30 days for releases with your automated tank gauging, interstitial monitoring from your ATG, your continuous in-tank leak detection system with high output throughput from a third-party provider. And any new or replaced S system requires a secondary containment and the use of an interstitial monitoring. And maintain these records for 1 year. So this is an annual test, or not an annual test, but 1 year worth of records. What I would say is that most systems are operating, most tribes are operating fairly new systems. So your monitoring is right on point with your ATG and outside contractors. Next slide. Here is an in-tank probe that connects to ATG for tank leak testing, water volume, and inventory. I've never actually seen anyone do this. Next slide. Here is your ATG. I need to get a picture, I apologize, of the newest version, which some of you are operating with and has a great capabilities and has a nice computer screen. Next slide, please. So your ATG can detect a 0.02 gallon per hour leak, and it all feeds off the system. And so when I come onto a facility, I'm going to go in and push a few buttons to see what alarms have been going on and what testing has been done. This is another type of ATG. I haven't actually seen this one used in any tribal facilities that I am aware of. Next slide. This is the one that I'm most familiar with. The next one is the Vita route. Next slide. Next slide. Third-party certifications. This is where you have an outside agency come in and do some of your leak detection and annual testing. Next slide. Here is some of your interstitial monitors. And the interstitial area is that space around, you can see in where the yellow is, there's that space around. That space is continuously being tested. Next slide. Interstitial monitors are used to check the area between the tank and the barrier for leaks. It needs to be checked every 30 days, and you can check using a dipstick as well. And of course, your ATG will also provide this monitoring. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Again, these are just talking about interstitial monitoring. Here is a report that was a third-party report from Warren Rogers, which is a company. But when you get a third-party certification, you need to keep a record of that. Next slide. Vapor monitoring and groundwater monitoring. Typically, all of your systems have a groundwater monitor. Next slide. Vapor monitoring, we're not going to go into that because while it is a requirement, it's not something I am going to be looking at per se as an inspector. Next slide. Next slide. And we have so many things to go through. I'm passing up some of these. Next slide. And next slide. Next slide. So here we are at piping release detection. There are two types of automated line leak detectors. There's the mechanical, which is with the red there. And then there's the electronic, which is the silver on the right-hand side. Next slide. And you will have been pretty much familiar with this if you're an owner operator. Piping must be monitored for releases by automatic line leak detector and annual line tightness testing, or have monthly monitoring. Next slide. So if you have a mechanical line leak detector, you need to have an annual line tightness test, an annual automatic line leak detector function test, and of course alerts operator through slow flow. So if you have a slow flow, it could be that you have are losing pressure in the line, which will restrict the flow. Electronic is the same requirements as has changed to the same requirements as mechanical. So you need to have the annual line tightness test. Next slide. And again, these are just samples, visual samples of what the mechanical automatic line leak detector looks like. Again, more. Next slide. And keep your results in your binder for 3 years. Next slide. And here is the sump areas. When I come on site, I am going to be looking under the dispensers as well. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Some of this is just repeating. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So, piping release detection, electronic line leak detectors. Electronic leak detectors are pressure sensing devices. They look for a leak when no one is attempting to pump fuel, meaning that nobody can be pumping any fuel from your system for them to determine if something's leaking. And it will pressurize the line to predetermine the pressure in it. The electronic leak detector will monitor the line pressure for a predetermined length of time. And this is where you're going to hear as a gas station manager, you might have like a downtime when you're able to do this. It's very difficult for busy stations to do this. Next. So there are two types of electronic line leak detectors. There's wired and wireless. Next. Here is a sample of a electronic automatic line leak detector printout that will give you the results of the line leak test. Next slide. So automatic line leak detectors, whenever a mechanical leak detector trips and cannot be reset, that might be an indication of a leak. Whenever an electronic leak line detector alarms or shuts down, and whenever you are unable to achieve a 0.02 gallon per hour leak test for the month. So these are some of the reasons why you may need to report a suspected release. Next slide. Of course, we talk about the need to keep your records and your record keeping in a good standing. Remember that binder. We don't want our records to look like this. And that's not good record keeping. Next slide. Next slide. Release reporting. Report suspected lease. Discovery of product or vapors on site is a way you can determine a failed tank test or fail line test indicate a leak. Unusual operating conditions such as sudden loss of a product or unexplained water in a tank. Errors in dispensing, and you need to report again 25 gallons or more. Next slide. Report any signs of a suspected tank or piping releases to the EPA within 24 hours. Again, that's going to be on a question that potentially will pop up. Suspected piping and tank releases must be reported. Next slide. And we haven't had any releases that I'm aware of, but you must investigate and confirm all suspected releases within 7 days by system testing and site checking. Next slide. Release investigation can be confirmed by system testing and site checking, repair and replace or upgrade the system, and begin corrective action if test results for the system indicate a leak. Next slide. Next slide. So perform within 24 hours of an identified or confirmed release, report the release, take action to prevent further release, and identify and mitigate fire, explosion, or other vapor hazards. Next slide. Investigations for soil and groundwater cleanups determine the full extent of the contamination. As a response to contaminated soils, a corrective action plan will be submitted and to address cleanup of groundwater and soil, and of course require public participation. Next slide. Here's an example of an area that had to be cleaned up. Next slide. Dealing with non-compliance. Start remediation immediately. If you cannot afford to repair all the problems, start with the highest volume first and set a timetable for EPA. EPA, of course, will work with you. Next slide. Have a plan. Next slide. We're not going to discuss the system closures. There will be some questions on the test about closures. So go ahead and go on to the next slide, 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 to the next slide. We're going to just talk about this real quickly. If you're going to remove an underground fuel storage tank, you as the tank owner are responsible to notify EPA 30 days prior to the closure. You're responsible to empty, remove the tank, piping, and clean and dispose, and do a sample soil assessment, and excavate a sample excavation of the zone, the bottom, the walls, the piping, and under repair. Handle and stores and treat and dispose of contaminated soils. Next slide. So submit the notice to EPA 30 days prior to closure. That's important, and will be a question on the test. That's an example of, next slide. These are some tanks that have been removed for obvious reasons. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Financial responsibility. Again, this is something we're going to be looking for in your binder. Next slide. You must demonstrate financial responsibility that will ensure the cost. It will ensure the cost of cleanup for a leaking underground storage tank, compensate third parties for bodily injury, and compensate property damage caused by a leaking underground storage tank. Next slide. So, of course, financial responsibility depends upon the type of business operation, how much of product is flowing through the tanks and out, and of course, the number of tanks. Next slide. Keep your financial responsibility records on site, meaning that, you know, sometimes the tribal office has it, but it actually needs to be in your gas station. You need to have it in your file, and typically the insurance is only good for 12 months. So make sure that your certificate of insurance is current. Next slide. And you have to, because of all of these things that have the potential to create a need for a cleanup, property damage and injuries, and of course this is all costly. Next slide. Financial responsibility requirements are designed to make sure that someone can pay for the cost of cleaning up leaks and compensating for third-party bodily injuries and other damage caused by leaking underground storage tanks. Next slide. Complying with the financial responsibility protects the owner and the operator. Next slide. Keep those records on site until at current and on site until the UST is closed. And of course, use your handy dandy binder. And again, I refer back to the sample binder that's available for you to download. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. One of the things that we talked about is having your Class C, A, B, or C certification. Of course, your Class A or B is going to be on the website that is that EPA has available for you, and then Class C is done by the Class A operator. Next slide. So a Class A operator is the one who's responsible for the US finances, handles financial responsibility, notifies EPA of any changes, and must pass the EPA online certification. Next slide. Class B is responsible for day-to-day operation, handles spills cleanups, manages deliveries, and then, of course, they must pass the EPA online inspection, again, prior to hire. And Class C operators must know who to notify in the case of a spill. You must have a C operator on site during your business hours. They are trained by the A or B operators, and clerks must be trained as C operators before assuming duties. Next slide. We're going to skip. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So you must have the requirements, and they're called new requirements. Some of you gas station managers have been doing this for a long time, might not realize, but you need to have your monthly walkthroughs. That's a requirement. So when I, as an inspector, come on, I'm going to look for the last 12 months of your monthly walkthroughs, and your equipment testing must also be available. Next slide. So Spill prevention tests must be done every 3 years to ensure watertight vacuum and pressure liquid testing, spill buckets, containment sumps for interstitial monitoring, and in your overflow equipment. Next slide. Annual release detection testing, and it must be operating properly, and we need to see that you have had it tested and keep those records for 3 years. So next slide. And again, every 30 days you must have a walkthrough. And I have included for you a monthly checklist walkthrough in the documents in this that you can download. And that monthly checklist was developed by EPA, and I'm sharing it with you. And it has a great checklist of all these things that you need to do during a monthly walkthrough. Next slide. And then you must have an annual walkthrough. But if you're doing the monthly walkthrough, you automatically do an annual. So it's the same monthly checklist. It's just that we want to see, December of last year to December of this year. Okay. If you've done it, and that's why the 12 months is important, is because then we can see that you've done it annually by doing the monthly. Next slide. Keep your records of your monthly walkthroughs for 1 year, and of course your test and inspections for 3 years. Next slide. Next slide. Safety. I just want to hit on this really fast. Safety, make sure that your employees are safe when they're doing their walkthroughs. You want to make sure they're using gloves, they have a safety vest, they have cones out there to make sure nobody hits them while they're doing their monthly safety checks. Next slide. And with that, I'm going to have us go down more. We're going to go down to keep going. Next slide. Next slide, because I see we're running out of time. Next slide, next slide, next slide. Next slide. Okay, right here. We're the online test. Here is the website for the EPA online test. Next slide. This is a sample of what the test looks like. You need to receive a score of 80% or higher to pass the exam. They do not keep the test. So every time you take the test, it's like a new person is taking the test. You can take it over and over until you achieve your Class A or Class B certification. And you need to print out your certification at that moment, because once you leave the website, it's gone. Next slide. You'll put your name in as you want it to appear on your certificate. Next slide. And then this is what the test looks like. So first question, what must owners, operators do if their UST fails the internal lining inspection and cannot be repaired according to a code of practice? What do you think it is? Repair the lining, following a code of practice, remove the lining and install another lining, permanently close the UST, or nothing. Well, if you said permanently close the UST, you are absolutely correct. Next slide. Next slide. And next slide. Questions. We have about 7 minutes. I'm sorry that I had to hurry up. There are some good resources for you. There's the Must for UST handbook. That is the Bible of us. And so take that, download it, print it, keep it on hand, have every one of your staff look at it, because that is everything in there is what's required of an owner operator. We have the sample binder for inspections that gives you all the tools to, have on hand what an inspector needs to see and what we will be looking at. And then I have the monthly checklist that EPA developed for you. And I also have the inspection checklist that when I, as an EPA inspector, comes to your facility, this is the document that I'm going to use to make sure that your facility is in federal compliance. And of course, you have my number and information. If you want a one-on-one where we do a little more thorough, we can do that. I apologize. It's a lot of information to do in 1 hour. And again, the Must for Us handbook that you have available to download will be your key to success and understanding the federal compliance rules. Are there any questions?
There was one question. Delbert asked, what's the difference between an automatic leak detector and a mechanical leak detector?
The automatic, I believe, is the one that's, again, you're asking the wrong person. I believe that the automatic is the one that's connected to your ATG. Unless somebody else has another answer. And the mechanical is not.
Okay. Well, that was the only question, so.
Cool. Well, thank you everyone for being here today. I appreciate it. I thank you for your time. And again, if you have any specific questions, you can contact me directly. I will be doing a more thorough 8-hour UST training with more of the test questions for the class A or B. Again, don't be afraid of that test, but make sure that you have it and you put it in your folder, and make sure, again, the monthly walkthrough can be used to certify your class C people. So you, if you're a manager, if you're a class A holder, you can just take your cashier and have them do the monthly walkthrough with you and sign it at the bottom, create a chart in the book, in the binder, and just say, on this day, Cecilia, gas girl, did the monthly walkthrough and is class C certified. You don't have to pay for this stuff. Like, I see a lot of gas station paying for things that, in my opinion, are just a waste of money.
Okay, I'm going to stop the broadcast now.
Thank you.